Hello, it's another week. The cacti haven't started to grow yet, and I also didn't do my reading for this week. So instead, I want to talk about some very basic questions in philosophy about the self, just, posing them using a piece of art. And I don't want to quibble too much about that word art. I mean, after all, what is art? Are we art? Is art art? Because at this point, right, nearly anything can be art. So don't let your opinions on what art should or shouldn't be color the rest of this discussion. I'm not going to try and define art. I'm not going to talk about different kinds of art. And I'm certainly not going to talk about preserving or supporting art. Just know that we're going to talk a little bit using a piece of art. And that piece of art is called the comedian. It's currently preserved at the Guggenheim. There's an article from the New York Times in the transcript you can link from. Very basically, the comedian is a banana taped to a wall. There are apparently 14 pages of instructions and a certificate of authenticity. Those are kind of useful for our extended metaphor we're about to go on. You can view it as a performance piece if you'd like, but what's good about the comedian is that I'm going to be able to use this to pose very basic questions about the self that we can, you know, look at very briefly. And if you want, you can take them, do some more thinking on it, maybe go look some philosophy up on your own. On your own. So this is going to be much more stream of consciousness than I usually will do. I'll usually be a lot more focused and prepared, but the other thing for our extended metaphor to remember is that the comedian isn't a person. So the way that you identify a thing is going to be very different than the self or other selves or people. So it's not going to be perfect. It's not a perfect allegory. But it's going to help us ask some philosophical, foundational questions every philosophy and religion tries to answer or pose. So let's use this banana taped to a wall to approach these questions on a very basic level. So the first question we're going to ask is probably the most foundational question, right? What is the real comedian or the real self? Conveniently for us, the comedian tries to define itself using two things. The first is that very descriptive method, those 14 pages of instruction. So, is something the comedian so long as it follows those 14-page guidelines? Think of it like you can have multiple different presentations of Shakespeare's play that are all recognizably the same thing. It's still Romeo and Juliet, whether it's got Leonardo DiCaprio or some random high school kid doing it, right? It's still Romeo and Juliet. So, is that what's core to the identity, right? Those that like 14 pages, check the box. Like, did we do this, this, and this? Then it's the comedian, then it's Romeo and Juliet. Uh, if you have an existential duck that can identify itself, reality, and others, is that duck a self? Or does it, is as long as it hits these marks, is that what it is? This is a descriptive route to the self, and you'll find that in some philosophies, not others. But the pushback you're going to feel about that, right, is that it's, like trying to classify anything that, you know, it's it gives you that moment where if you have 8 legs, you're a spider. Modern actual taxonomy, much more detailed, and wouldn't have something that basic. But then you are going to see things that, well, that thing has 8 legs, but it's not a spider. And so maybe these 14 pages of instruction aren't right. And now, two ways to approach that, right? Okay, that's wrong. We're going to try something else. Or maybe we just need 20 pages of instruction, 25. Like, maybe we just need a better, more exhaustive checklist. So let's assume that you don't want to be purely descriptive box checking. That theory of, how to identify a thing doesn't work for you. The comedian gives us a second way to confer identity upon something. This certificate of authenticity. Is there some sort of analogous certificate of authenticity for the self that isn't just a greatly reduced checklist. Kind of, right? Because, like, take the soul in, whatever version of religion that has the soul you want to take, where something has an identity if it has a soul, but it can't really it really sort of elides over what is the soul. It's something that is arbitrarily given, like a certificate of authenticity. You can apply this to anything, and it's it's much more yes no, and it's very broad, but it's also externally granted, right? It's not based around the reality that we can interact with, touch, and feel, like those 14-page guidelines where we can go up to the wall, we can say yes it's a banana, yes it's at this angle. The certificate of authenticity is externally granted. Now granted, in this case, the Guggenheim or whoever gave them that certificate of authenticity, I think it was the actual original artist. So they have some more authority than what you're going to see when you're trying to decide what gives the self that certificate of authenticity. How do we determine what is an authentic self and what's an inauthentic self? And do we even have a way of knowing that? And it again gets to this very sticky philosophical area, because are we, like, how do we make sure we're not just taking those guidelines and narrowing it down to one thing, or more, how, if this is externally granted, do we even know it exists? Is it a useful thing? Again, we're not going to go into a lot of details on this, but it's another way to sort of think about the self. And when you look at that, the certificate of authenticity has its own problems, right? It simply states this thing that you have put me next to is the comedian, or however you display that certificate of authenticity. If I get that certificate of authenticity and I glue an apple to a wall, does that certificate impart the identity of the comedian to that thing I glued to the wall? If the certificate of authenticity is what's giving you yourself, the answer there is yes. But we probably all, including myself, are like, no, that can't be right. It can't simply be something external has defined what it is. But maybe it is, right? Maybe if you think about it, you're like, well, the identity of the comedian isn't, if it isn't based on those 14-page guidelines, if it's based on an external authority granting you an identity, granting you the ability to say, I am a self, I am self-aware, I have an understanding of myself and others, then maybe yes, if I give this certificate of authenticity to an apple glued to the wall, that is now the comedian. This gives you the same problem you have without a certificate of authenticity, where if I follow that 14-page guideline, did I just create a new comedian? Is this its own identity? Are they the same thing? And so, again, this is why there's a lot of philosophy written about what is the self, how do we identify the self. And as we're talking about this, we hit another problem that we're going to go into a little more detail here. What exactly is the comedian that we're trying to identify? The one in the Guggenheim, for example, I'm pretty sure, and I think if you read the article, they actually are talking about how they're trying to preserve this art, because it's not the same banana, it's on a different wall, and it's not using the same piece of duct tape. So just like you yourself have changed physically, the cells in your body change out, die off, your own ideas and thoughts might change or might not. And some people go through their life and they feel, they feel pretty confident in what they believe, and so they don't have radical changes in, their belief structure. But some people do change. So which of those instances of yourself are yourself? Which comedian is the real comedian, since it's no longer got the same banana, wall, or duct tape? Now, other people have probably made this connection before I did, so I'm not going to think I'm super smart for coming up with it, but this is basically the same sort of philosophical problem ancient philosophers, I want to say Greeks, Greeks tried to tackle with the I want to call it a mental problem, like a thought experiment called the ship of Theseus. Theseus being a famous, I want to say again, Greek hero who sailed out to sea, and his ship gets beat up, and he loses parts, he replaces it. Finally, one day, it's got none of the same parts, just like the comedian at the Guggenheim. And so two of his crew are like, hey, is this still the same ship? This is a thought experiment, and that we're gonna, we've been using the comedian at the Guggenheim to be a modern ship of Theseus. So that's a really interesting question, right? Is the ship of Theseus the physical ship? And as we've replaced the parts, have we changed its identity? Even if we replaced a board for an exact replica but a different board? Or is the ship of Theseus what the crew thinks of the ship? It's the ship we're on, it's the ship we did our heroics on. Which of these is the ship of Theseus? Which of these is the identity of the comedian? Is the comedian the actual physical thing, which is now gone and lost forever, because the banana's obviously gone and lost forever, and the duct tape's probably in some landfill somewhere? Or is it the idea of the comedian? Is that the identity of the thing? And you're going to be able to find a lot of philosophical ink spilled over trying to come up with different answers to that philosophical problem of the ship of Theseus. And the core thing that thinking about that does, though, is it lets you sort of think about how do you relate to yourself as you change? Because the obvious next step in our extended metaphor is, okay, now that you think you know how you want to answer the ship of Theseus, what about a person, a self, who changes? Which of those is the real them? What's more important, the physical them? Like, is it if you upload your identity to a computer in a few years, is that you on the computer, or is that you that's that physical you? Which of these is you? It's going to be something that you're going to have a lot of people doing a lot of thinking about, and it's asking one of the most foundational questions of philosophy. And it's interesting that the ancient Greeks came up with this question about a ship, and now we're asking the same thing about a banana being stuck to a wall. And I don't really have much more to say than that, because this was, again, really just trying to ask some questions and take this rather silly thing, again, a banana being taped to a wall, and using it to try and talk about the idea of the self, different ways you can try and think about it. And again, you'll notice there weren't a whole lot of references or quotes because this is more stream of consciousness, but if any of those answers were interesting to you, you can probably go around and find better, more in-depth answers. You can probably go read, you know, I'm willing to bet there's dozens of books about the ship of Theseus, probably dozens of essays. And so you can go out there, and now that you sort of know the sort of questions being asked, you can go out there and find someone who's way smarter than me who's going to talk about them in a more interesting way. So, which brings us back to the very start where, well, yes, I'm kind of making fun of the idea that a banana stuck to a wall can be art. If I'm not an art historian, but you can use something even that silly to start talking about some foundational concepts, maybe there is some value to preserving something like that. Maybe not at the Guggenheim, but maybe there is a purpose to it. Or maybe not. Maybe it's just a stupid banana taped to a wall. Anyway, thank you.